It's my pleasure to introduce outgoing and now former Provost John Siliciano and our Dean of Faculty, Eve DeRosa. Until January, John was Cornell's interim provost, having returned from retirement to serve in that capacity while the university undertook the search for a new provost. The search, for those of you who don't know, has been recently concluded with the appointment of Professor of Computer Science, Kavita Bala. And she made a presentation to the Faculty Senate last week, and I frankly was very impressed. I think we can look forward to some wonderful leadership by Kavita. John's Cornell connection began in 1971 as a freshman in the College of Arts and Sciences. He graduated summa cum laude in history at Cornell in '75 and earned an MPA in Princeton and a JD at Columbia subsequently. And he went to work to clerk for Chief Judge Willard Feinberg of the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Second Circuit and for Justice Thurgood Marshall on the U.S. Supreme Court. Having fond memories of growing up in central New York, he actually grew up in Elmira, if I'm not mistaken, he and his family decided to return home to Ithaca from Washington and take up life back where he grew up. He joined the Cornell Law School's faculty in 1984, taught and eventually served as associate dean, vice dean, and interim dean of the law school. In 2005, he moved to Cornell's central administration to become vice provost, later promoted to senior vice provost for academic affairs, and then on subsequently to be appointed deputy provost in 2016. With the appointment of new provost, as I said, John can now return to his life as a mild-mannered emeritus professor and administrator. Something to look forward to for sure. Since 2021, Eve DeRosa has been the Dean of the Faculty at Cornell and the Mibbs Martin Follett Professor in Human Ecology. As the Dean of the Faculty, many of you are aware, she leads the Senate and oversees 13 Senate committees, working groups, covers areas in education and employment policy, among many other things. It's a large, expansive kind of appointment that requires lots of diplomatic skill. So thank you. She received her BA in biology and psychology from Vassar, her PhD in animal neuroscience and experimental psychology from Harvard, and completed postdoctoral training in human neuroscience at Stanford in the School of Medicine. Eve joined the faculty in human ecology in 2013 from the University of Toronto. And she's taught and done research that spans behavioral and neuroscientific studies on attention, learning, and healthy aging. At Cornell, she's held various leadership positions, including Director of Undergraduate Studies, where she streamlined graduation requirements, and Associate Dean. As Associate Dean, she worked to foster an inclusive college-wide culture in the College of Human Ecology. As happens every decade, more or less, Cornell finds itself at a moment of transition as it searches for new leadership and is challenged with national, international political events, and recovers, of course, from our first pandemic in a century. Well, as many of you know who have long experience with the university, we've been here before. Cornell's long history has included many such moments as the institution encounters and undertakes the inevitable cycles of succession of leadership and various crises. Indeed, such changes are intrinsic to the lives of enduring institutions such as ours. We've been very fortunate to have seasoned leaders like John and Eve, and of course, Michael Kotlikoff as well, to see us through this current period of transition. In response to the moment, during the past year, Eve has invited the Faculty Senate and other faculty members to revisit the longstanding refrain, any person, any study. And I think she'll speak to that briefly after we begin. At the same time, John has brought to bear his long experience in many roles at Cornell to navigate the challenges the university has experienced recently. So we've invited them to have a broad-ranging conversation about Cornell. And for lack of a better way of putting it, it seems to me that the questions are, where have we been? Where are we now? And where are we going? So we hope that you will take the opportunity to ask questions of John and Eve. After all, collectively, you have an enormous store of experience with Cornell as faculty, staff, administrators, parents, and even as students. So Eve, John, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kent. Good morning, everyone. I'm very thankful to be here on the stage with John. We overlapped for only a few months, but I heavily relied on John in those months as I was transitioning into the Dean of Faculty position. As you heard, I was a faculty member in the Department of Psychology at the University of Toronto for 10 years before coming to Cornell. And my relationship with Cornell started with being invited to give a talk in neurobiology and behavior. And when I gave my talk, I do both rat and human neuroscience. I came to give a talk about my rat data. And at the end of the talk, I spoke for over an hour with all these fascinating people. And they were asking questions, and I would give them human data, and we were just talking. I was loving the conversations, and I went home, and I had all this affection for Cornell. And then I got a call saying, "Hey, have you ever thought about moving?" And I wasn't sure. I was very happy where I was. But when I came to give my job talk and speak with the chair, who was Chuck Brainerd at the time, Chuck did something that really blew me away. He started with Abraham Lincoln and the Morrill Land Grant Act. And he really shared with me the values of Cornell and that founding principle, that radical founding principle, where any person, any study, but also the idea of it also being non-sectarian. So just radically inclusive, but also it was meant to be comprehensive. A.D. White, as president, wanted this great university to be both about science and the humanities. And I think that's going to be a big part of what our future needs to be. And so I'm so proud to be on the stage with John. One thing that Kent did not share is John is also a parent of a Cornellian. So he's got student perspective, faculty perspective, parent perspective, and then all his years of central leadership. And so with that, I'm going to give this to John.
Thank you, Eve. And it's delightful to be here, and particularly seeing so many people I know, either directly in person or know from years of working at Cornell, and have heard of all the wonderful things and reputations of you folks. So it's really great to be here. Though I should say at the beginning that I think I'm here under false advertising, in that from gathering from the announcement and then a whole series of questions that the executive board of CAPE sent to me, that I'm supposed to be a sage on higher education. This is not what I am. I am more, if I think about it, if I had to describe my career, I'm an accidental bureaucrat. And I've been around a long time, so I have been through, I have served at the same time as 4 presidents, 3 interim presidents, 4 provosts, 3 interim provosts, including me. So and I've actually, if you looked at my resume, you'd think this guy made a career out of leadership roles with a modifier in front of them. So, I was associate dean, vice dean, deputy dean, interim dean, vice provost, senior vice provost for academic affairs, deputy provost, and interim provost. Those are all the titles of central leadership, except interim president. And I told Mike, I'm a patient man. Sicilians can wait. Accidents happen. I make her complete that run of bureaucratic titles. But, I like to I get the questions. It's why did you stay so long? But when faculty ask me it, there's an undertone of what is wrong with you? And here's how it happened: is I was an undergraduate here in the history department. I came in 1971. I met my wife Rosie. She was a math major. Things were very simple then. I took the bus from Elmira, walked up to campus into U-Haul 3. Walked up to Golden Smith, and I was given my first semester course on a 3x5 handwritten card. I got that. Rosie and I met at the end of freshman year. I was dating her then best friend, but that's a different story. And we had a very simple life. We didn't have a lot of money. We would have peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and share a tea bag from hot water we got in the Temple of Zeus. It was just a very different world, but we loved it here. And we were lucky enough to come back here in 74 when I joined the law faculty. And and Rosie is an attorney in town. I was very happy at the law faculty as a faculty member. It's a wonderful, wonderful life. And a lot of faculty don't, at least at the law school, don't appreciate how amazingly privileged it is to be a faculty member and what important work they do. But I at one point, the associate dean there, a very good friend, developed some prostate issues, something that some of us can relate to. And he needed to take a leave. And so I came in for one semester. That was the deal. He would be back. He didn't come back, at least into administration. And then over the next 4 years, we went through 7 deans and interim deans. It was a period of transition. And I just, one person after another, I was the sort of only one that was sort of continuity. So I ended up staying and getting these titles as things progressed. And then Biddy Martin asked me to come up to the central administration. And I thought I'd go there for 3 years and then go back to the faculty lounge and talk about the lazy and incompetent bureaucrats in Day Hall. But then Jeff Lehman retired suddenly after 1 year. Biddy Martin left in the dead of night. Provost and presidents came and left. Hunter came back once, then he came back later. Beth Garrett tragically died after 9 months. And so I just was the kid who didn't get out quick enough. When I grew up, there was this, whatever game we would play, there'd always be a bad person in it, a monster or whoever. And as soon as someone announced the game, everyone in the room would say, "Not it." So that's how we chose who got stuck. And I was just not fast enough at "not it." So I stayed around. So that's one reason I stayed around. But the other reason, and I think we can come back to this later, is I have just, it was the greatest privilege of my life to work with all the people in the leadership roles at both the law school and particularly at the central administration. And, they were not the sort of lazy, incompetent bureaucrats that faculty, somewhat jokingly like to imagine, but they are just these tremendous servants of the public good of the university. And I just felt incredibly privileged. And they're sitting here. There's Joe Thomas, there's Charlie, there's Frank Robinson, there's Betsy East. I could go all around the room of people that dedicated their efforts to serving this university. And I just felt that they were remarkable people that gave up the life of a faculty member, which is equally important, to serve those faculty, serve those students, and serve the university in this selfless way. And they were selfless instead of self-serving, which is what I'm afraid we're seeing a lot in leadership roles outside the university. And I just felt, and I ran most of the dean searches during those 20 years. And we kept hiring remarkable people that I wanted to stay around with and learn from. And so that's what kept me, here so long. But that's a long way of saying that I didn't come here because I'm a student of higher education. I didn't stay up, reading the Chronicle of Higher Education. I didn't wake up in the night worrying about the future of the humanities. Much of my work was, it was sort of like a mechanic. I just helped the university run. And, I've heard over time different descriptions. It's called a fixer, a cop, a therapist, a bouncer, a diplomat, an architect. My favorite one, which I only heard once, was I was the consigliere. And, I'm Sicilian, I like, and a lawyer, so it worked. But I'm not a great thinker, but so I'll do my best to talk about some of the questions that were here. But again, I don't wake up at night worrying about these big questions. What I would wake up at night is worrying about the sort of more mechanical issues. So here's an example. Honest to God, I had this dream last night that did wake me up. I woke up, I had been pulled back into the central administration. Mind you, I've tried to retire 3 times now, and I got pulled back in. Somehow I was in the war room. We have war rooms. They're usually in the boardroom where the deans meet, but it was around some crisis. And the crisis was that we're in difficult union negotiations with a union of 4 people that did some critical thing outdoors. And the negotiations had stalled, and they'd asked me to come back in and facilitate and all that stuff. And the union had given us a list of demands, but the demands was basically a catalog from a Swedish high-end manufacturer of sheepskin clothing. And it was just beautiful stuff, and you open it and it's just amazingly gorgeous stuff, page after page. There was even a page where you could get your whole house coated in sheepskin. And I kept thinking, oh man, we can't do this, like, can't we do a little LL Bean, but it was, it was a typical war room with the president, the provost, and the deans and vice presidents, arguing and thinking. And then it turned out that we were in big trouble because a former communications director had written something in the Cornell Chronicle that said, these people are an indispensable, service to the community, and they deserve everything. And I thought, oh God, now we have this soundbite that we have to somehow figure out how to say, but they don't deserve sheepskin covering their roofs. So that's a long disclaimer of why I'm the wrong person to pontificate. But that said, let me touch on a few. So CAPE the executive board was wonderful. They gave me a whole series of questions, most of which I don't have answers to, but they were great questions. But I'll touch on a few and kind of summarize them around 3 different themes that seem to emerge from a lot of the questions. So I'll read, the first question is what Eve touched upon, is the nature of Cornell's education, what it's providing, how students are pursuing it, how we think about education. Ron Hoy, for example, phrased this very well. He arrived in 1974, shortly after I did. Cornell offered a stunning broad curriculum of studies spread across multiple colleges and myriad departments. And the humanities was a large, thriving discipline favored by many undergraduates. Now there is a perception that we have become much more of a science technology campus to the detriment of the liberal arts, especially humanities. What's your take on this? And is it the right path for Cornell? Susan McCooch, which I understand she's in South America, asked similar questions about how does an education differ from job training. Mary Beth Norton, hers is along the same lines. I recently spoke at an event for alums in Ann Arbor who had been history majors and who had asked to talk about how that major had affected their life and choices. How would you respond to a similar question about our history department and your experiences as a major? And then Mary Beth tacks on, as I recall, you never took one of my courses, which is either a reprimand or a statement of gratitude. But I was a history major. I did my honors thesis with Will Provine and Larry Moore. It was the single most important transformative thing in my academic career. It was the most rigorous, difficult, challenging, wonderful experience. And it set an example for me of how to do really good work and work really hard. It was fantastic. And even though I became a lawyer, it was truly transformative. So I agree completely with the kind of concerns here about what our students are studying and are they getting that. And there is, we are in a period where the humanities don't have nearly as many students as they used to. And this is not true across all departments. And it's really hard to calibrate because Cornell's size has grown, but relative to some of the other disciplines, things have shifted there. And this is why the any person, any study is a critical thing. But what I would also observe is what has happened is not a decline in the humanities or the university's investment in it, but a growth in many, many other areas. And a lot of this is simply driven by the changes in student interest. And so that students come in with a lot of them, as Susan's question suggests, more career focused earlier on in their career. And so when I was here, arts and sciences was the hardest college to get into. Currently, the hardest two programs to get into are the undergraduate business school, the Dyson School, which is part of the College of Business, and the newly named Bowers College of Computer and Information Science. These are extremely hard. Admissions rates are around 2% compared to 4 or 5% for arts and all the other schools as well. In fact, the difficulty in getting into those colleges is so difficult now that students are strategic in applying, is that they will apply to a quote weaker college, which means incredibly hard to get into, just to transfer to computer science, for example. So students in art will say, I am interested in majoring in English, which will be attractive in their admissions. They'll come and then they'll transfer to computer science. So we have this stream of student interest. It's very hard for the university to even come to a judgment about whether that's right or wrong. We don't centrally ever direct curriculum. That belongs in a much more organic way to the faculty. And so programs grow out of faculty interest. They don't very often grow out of some central decision that we should steer our students here or there. And in fact, those of you, of course, on the faculty know that the faculty essentially owns the curriculum. And the university over time has been urged to make sure that every student has a course in this or that, a mandatory requirement, structuring some first-year curriculum. Those efforts have gone on for years, but they never seem to yield anything. And so it is a bit of a running joke, but also quite true that the only universal requirement for Cornell undergraduate is that they pass the swim test. And we tried to even ease that. In COVID, we took a break from that. That was hard to do. And then there was conversation about getting rid of it. And I think it's still here. I left, it was gone, it's still here. So it's very hard to direct this. And I think we're in an age where the appreciation of the value of the humanities is less. We have a president who went to an undergraduate business school and who doesn't value education at all. And we're sort of at the mercy of these things. But Cornell does, the thing I would also suggest in terms of Ron's question is, Cornell still is amazingly diverse. It's got over 90 departments. It is the most complicated American university, probably the most complicated university in the world, in that it is an Ivy League university with a land grant mission stemming from the post-Civil War. It is private, but it has 4 colleges that have New York State public obligations. It has campuses here, 2 in New York, 1 in the Middle East, 1 in Geneva. It has over 90 departments. It's been growing better varieties of rice in Asia for a century, and it's steering the the rovers on Mars. It is, the breadth of Cornell is just withering, or beautiful, however you want to put it. You know, it makes college universities like Princeton look, you know, sort of quaint in terms of its scale and its dimension. And one other reason I stayed so long is that I could never, after 20 years there, could never find the outer edges of the university. You know, I knew a lot of how it operated, and by the end I probably knew more about how it operated. But I could not, you know, there was always something that was amazing to me. So I do worry about where students go, and, you know, whether careerism is becoming so central to many of their goals. You know, we recently created a Department of Real Estate that was driven by donors, but it worried me, and I helped do the institutional architecture for it about how it would operate and where the faculty. But that worried me as an undergraduate program to come to Cornell and study real estate, as opposed to something broader. But we don't have a lot of, you know, we are this big ship with all sorts of complexity, and it's quite hard to steer it institutionally. Let me touch on just 2 others. You know, in some, you know, we're still extremely diverse, and I think a lot of the growth, you know, reflects where societal interests are. There's a number of questions in here about the protests over the last 2 years, the student protests. Questions from Joe Thomas, Mary Katzenstein. You know, are they different? Are they the same as what we saw? And, you know, we've seen you all, and we have seen generations of protests. When I was an undergraduate, it was obviously about Vietnam, and I was marginally involved, meaning when Carpenter Hall and the engineering college was taken over by students, I stepped in a broken window and then stepped out so that I could say I was part of a student occupation. Check that box. At the same time, Mike Kotlikoff was getting tear gassed down in a march against the war in Washington. But we saw the divestment protests in the 80s. My wife was a judicial administrator there, and there were cases with 300 students in mass trials. It was a really difficult time. So these protests, student activity has gone on for a long time. So the number of questions about, is it different now, and how is the university's response to it? And I, with the wisdom or the crankiness of old age, I see a lot of similarities to all of these. And you know, what I sort of see myself in a younger way in some of the students that have been engaged. There is the same incredible level of intensity. There's the same kind of youthful arrogance, certainty about it. There's the same search for students to need to be effective in the real world. And I think this is what is interesting to me, is that the students on the sort of, for want of a better name, and this is not a good label, but the pro-Palestinian students who had most of the activism, the campouts last year, the graffiti, and the shutting down of a career fair this year. They're underneath, they're students that are dismayed about world events, and they are desperate to have some impact in their real life. And they're at Cornell in this wonderful university, struggling to find how to be impactful in some way. And so they use a very complicated logic to redirect their anger at the university, because they need something where they feel they have some agency or ability to change things. And so it's very hard for me to tease out the logic of it, but it's that Cornell as a university is complicit in what's happening in Gaza, because Cornell invests in very large index stock funds made of many, many individual stocks. Those stocks include companies like Boeing. Boeing makes aircraft. Those aircraft include apparently aircraft that are sold to the Israeli government, and therefore Cornell is complicit in this. So it's a very attenuated theory of causation, but it's all the student, it's the way they feel they have some agency to affect something that, and I don't think that's very different than the divestment protests or the war protests at Cornell. It's that same energy. And a lot of people found it confusing or very distressing when this was happening on campus, and it still is. My sense in this, when I talked to Mike Kolikoff and I went around and talked to every faculty and many student groups at the beginning of this last academic year, to try to diffuse some of this energy, or try to have conversations about where we drew lines and what we encouraged. And one of the points I tried to make is to faculty that were very distressed about this, is I thought, if there's any place where students can learn how to participate in a complicated, diverse world, it's at a university. It's a largely safe space in which they can fight and argue and disagree over things, and then the university still continues to be committed to their education. But it has been difficult, it has been challenging, and I think what's made this different, and this gets to the questions that I received, is that first of all, there is a deep schism among the students, and that's not something that I've seen in previous periods of unrest on campus. Previous periods had an activist group, and then most other students were either sympathetic or disinterested. But now we have two camps of students that are quite sharply at odds with each other. And that's very difficult for the university to mediate between them, and it ends up feeling like it did as a no-win situation. I think last year you probably saw, I wasn't on campus, but I could absolutely tell what was happening after the attack on Israel. Within several days, Martha Pollack had issued 4 different statements. And what was clear is that every statement, which was intended to address concerns and anxiety and anguish, triggered but you said this, but you didn't that. That was the university being caught between 2 things that it very much valued, and being expected to sort of toe the line. And it reached a point really where it was a no-win situation. And that's been very difficult. We've spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure out what the right line is. It finally led Mike Kolikoff and me to decide that for our interim period, we were not making any more statements other than ones that directly affected the university. Because commenting on world affairs, Cornell doesn't have a foreign policy, was just not helping the situation. The other thing that's really complicated things is that the university is now a political football. The attack on the university is being fueled by outside forces that have used this conflict as a wedge, quite viciously and quite purposefully. And so there was just constant tension on whether universities were disciplining this group or protecting this group or throwing this group out. We would get hundreds of emails a day that were vitriolic from all different perspectives And you saw that when Congress hauled in the university presidents of several of our peers, and they ended up losing their jobs within weeks. So that context has made it quite different than other protests, and we can return to this. The final thing, and I should wrap up and then we can talk more, is there are questions about the current political climate. And again, I don't have deep insights on this, but Phil Lewis, who is somebody who has deep insights, Phil Lewis, Mel Neschheim, a number of you, Ron Ehrenberg, have wonderfully sophisticated knowledge of universities and where they have been and where they're going. But Phil writes, having written about the response of higher education to climate change and having studied recently two other existential threats to civilization as we know it, those being artificial intelligence and radically disproportionate inequality in wealth and power, I am inclined not to reject, but to downplay the view that Cornell has faced past challenges comparable to the current ones and can now draw useful guidance from its history of dealing with crises. My question is whether the current bundle or cascade of major challenges is not indeed unprecedented with those in the past. And then he goes on to say, might the present conjuncture not call for the kind of collective action, presumably in concert with sister institutions that had not previously been envisioned or attempted? And this obviously is in reference to the very overt hostility of the current administration to higher education in many, many domains. The most dramatic one, recently one, was the decision of the federal government to greatly slash funding for biomedical research by limiting the indirect cost recovery on federal grants dramatically. But this is along with all sorts of other hostility towards higher education. That is unprecedented, and that gives me a worry that I didn't have. We've overcome many, many things. The university, COVID looked like a terrible threat, and Cornell actually succeeded immensely in handling that. This does look to me like an existential threat to the university. Just in terms of money alone, cutting the indirect funding for biomedical research is probably in the neighborhood of $100 million a year. That is money that we do not have. We run on very thin margins. This is, I know that in Day Hall they are, and Eve can testify this, they are in the war room meeting around the clock about how to handle this. And they are, as the question suggests, as Phil's question, they are now working actively in concert with the other research universities to try to limit the damage of this very overt anti-academic effort by the central administration. This is really worrisome. I don't have deep insights. My only solace really is that, again, going back to the remarkable service ethic of the people in the university, they are literally, quite literally working around the clock. They are the most, selfless, dedicated group of people that I've ever known, ever had the privilege of knowing. I don't know where this will come, but I do have not complete confidence that there is a solution, but I do have faith that if there is one, Cornell will find it. So I've gone on too long. Let me turn this back to Eve for anything else, and then we might have time for a few questions.
I can speak to just this moment with the current threats from the new administration. So Provost Bala has a response team that meets 8 a.m. in the morning, just like the COVID response team. It's being treated with that level of urgency. And they're being very planful because not only are the indirect costs for biomedical research a potential threat, but also the threat on having a tax on the endowment Thus far, we have not been included in those dozens of universities, but they're going to lower the threshold presumably, and also increase the percentage of the tax. So that's another 100 million that we may have to confront. But I just wanted to say that when Provost Bala came to the Faculty Senate last week, people were asking for that anxiolytic, how are we prepared for this? And I thought she said something very, very important and that I would want to share with you here is that please know that there has to be some level of trust and grace, and that please know that we're working behind the scenes, we're being planful, we're doing plans about the budget and policy, and they're really thinking deeply about it. But we cannot act in anticipation. At this moment, Cornell is lawful. So I don't know how many of you read the Dear Colleague letter that came out last Friday. It was venomous. And it made it seem like universities are doing illegal things. We are not. Cornell is a very inclusive place, but it is not an illegal place. And so there's an assault not only on any person, but there's an assault on the any study. But we are thinking about these things, how to plan for these things. One of the things that the Senate has been trying to do is to start asking that question about what is the future of any person, any study. And there are senators asking for us to just think about also the future of the liberal arts in general. So we'll try to have these conversations as a faculty at least, and you are all invited to join those conversations when we have them.
So we have time for a few questions.
Anyone want to raise their hand? Okay.
Hi, I'd like to ask if,
Hold it closer to your mouth.
yeah, I'd like to ask whether you have any comments about the precarious position of graduate students at this moment. And included in that is the union that they formed a year ago that's been negotiating with the administration at Cornell and has yet to come to an agreement. But do you think that the university in the current circumstances is going to downsize its graduate program substantially in response to current events?
So thank you for the question. So the graduate students voted some time ago to form a union, and they elected the United Electrical. It's a longer term, but it's UE is the union that they voted. So that they are represented by that union. We've been in negotiations with them for the entire period. They've been difficult negotiations because the list of union requests and demands is quite extraordinary. This is not unusual. This is the first round of negotiating with the union, and typically at most universities that have reached an agreement around unionization of the graduate students, it takes a few years to resolve the first graduate reunion, first agreement, collective bargaining agreement. It has been difficult in particular ways. One is that this union is very political in its national advocacy. It has a very stark pro-Palestinian plank in its own literature and public relations. This makes it quite challenging for Cornell to require all of its graduate students to join this union, because they will in essence be subsidizing political speech that's unrelated to their status as graduate students. These are the students, the teaching assistants and graduate assistants. So we have been engaged. Again, this is one of these things that there's weekly meetings in terms of that. When I left, we had made a lot of progress on most of the real issues that affect graduate students, but there is still some open issues about requiring all students to join, even if they're strongly opposed to the particular political position that the union is taking. So there's that issue about whether it's a requirement of a graduate student. There is also the outstanding economic demands of the union. At the universities that do have graduate student unions, the cost has escalated. We are running very, very tight budgets, and I don't know what the latest modeling shows, but we carefully model that if the contracts are of a certain stature, they're going to require funding levels that may be difficult to maintain the size of the graduate student body. There are whole series of other questions about the graduate school and do we deploy those resources correctly. So this is under constant study. I don't have a clear answer to that. Eve works more in this space.
I can say that it is challenging. There are faculty who have sympathies with the grad students, and we have to remind all of our faculty that they're managers and not everyone takes that perspective. And so we have to deal with the actual realities of our graduate students are likely to strike this semester, making sure that faculty are prepared for that they're holding on to the academic materials. Some faculty with sympathies to the union see it as faculty who will grade the assignments are crossing a picket line. And it's a very difficult and challenging time to have this conversation happening on campus, along with the other challenging conversations. But our graduate students, I think, have agreed to the fact that we can separate the academic mission from their employment. And that was a critical part of the conversation as well, that faculty still will be able to hold the academic standard and to determine whether you are meeting those standards or not. And that was a really critical part of the first part of the conversation, was to establish that. That is done. And now it's the open shop versus agency shop versus closed in terms of membership.
Another question?
I was just wondering, considering the relationship between war and what's happening to the climate, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a different set of index funds that didn't have such an impact on the environment? I mean, jet fuel is very bad for the environment.
Yeah, very good question. I think that's beyond my expertise in terms of what we invest in and how we control the portfolios. I understand the question. I just am coming up short with an answer.
I can't answer that question, but I can say that Cornell has a really strong focus on climate and on sustainability. And currently, the new administration has that also in its lens, I guess, its focus. And so there has to be a commitment from also the federal agencies to this. And at this moment, that's in question. So it's a challenging time.
But that, this helps illustrate what a remarkable place Cornell is that it is leading innovations in all sorts of climate change related areas. So lake source cooling was an enormous gamble by Cornell that has now, it cools our buildings in the summer, a tremendous enterprise that was a partnership between government agencies and the university. Currently, we're trying to do the inverse of that, called earth source heating. So we've drilled test wells down thousands of feet. It's over actually near the apple orchards, with the goal of seeing whether there's enough heat in the earth at that point that we can extract it in a manner similar to the lake source cooling to be able to heat the campus. Incredibly expensive, exploratory, not been done by anyone else adventure. It requires a lot of federal funding. And so this partnership that's existed between universities doing this kind of research and the federal government, that's what's under broad threat. So it's not just the specifics of NIH funding, it's the idea that universities and government participate to push things forward for the social benefit.
I can say that one of the things we are working on is the Concur travel system that we all have to use for travel. We're trying to put in a calculator so that people will know what the cost of the carbon cost is for their travel. And then they can decide whether they should all get in a van together, they should fly, attend by Zoom. But those, we're trying to give people the information so they can make an educated choice.
Maybe time for one more question?
One more, and I'm not sure I know how to ask it. Is there any role for the U.S. Congress in today's environment?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that either. Are you talking about this U.S. Congress? Yeah, it is. You know, we've watched the I've watched the confirmations, and the votes have been 52 to 48, including confirming people that are just you know, the head of. I won't go into it, but it is very frightening. And again, it reflects a level of anti-academic, anti-intellectual, that anti-science, not just anti-science, anti-humanities, that's just unprecedented in my experience. And I think I think it reflects a deeper pathology within the culture and the society at large.
I'm going to try and end on a good note. And the positive note is our land grant mission. So we are in every county of New York State, and we're doing a public service. We're getting our intellectual material out for substantive impact in New York. So reach out to your Congress, because they should care what's happening in their counties. And what Cornell is doing, the good that we're doing out in the world. So I'm going to leave on that note.